Hey, I'm Lawrence Sher. You can call me Larry, ASC member. I'm here at the ASC Clubhouse in Hollywood talking about Joker. My relationship with Todd is as strong a collaboration as I've had in the film industry, and it's something I relish. First and foremost, he's an excellent filmmaker. I knew that even from old school. I remember even from the opening shots of, like, in the credit sequence when Luke Wilson is in this conference, Todd put just a little bit of like a green hue to it, like an ugly fluorescent. He was cool with it feeling real. It wasn't about, quote unquote, the traditional comedy look of brighter is better, and there was always a sort of a sense that comedies are first and foremost about the jokes and they're less about the cinema. We were always about the cinema. As far as we were concerned, we were making a movie first and foremost. We were making something that should feel cinematic and should service the story more than the jokes. And that the jokes, if set in a real environment, would play even better. And all the movies that we appreciated and all the techniques that they were using, whether it was like shooting long lens like Ridley Scott on an action movie, they could still apply even to a comedy. And with The Hangover, we were also trying to tell the story of kind of the glossless Vegas. Like, what's behind the scenes in Vegas? What are the dirty lots? What does Vegas look like during the day? By its intention, it was like, let's make it a little dirtier, let's make it a little grittier, let's make it a little more real, and drive everything off of that principle. And I think just because of some of those decisions, it maybe then people started saying, wow, it doesn't really feel like a comedy per se, and suddenly then it takes off and makes a huge amount of money and is a huge success. So then it gets even more, I think, recognition for some of the things it did differently than your traditional comedy. I had the weirdest conversation with Todd, which is we'd done 5 movies together. I had directed, but I was shooting Godzilla. So I'd gone back to shooting, and Todd goes, oh my God, I got this script I wrote, and it's like, I'm so excited about it, and I want you to shoot it, but I just want to know, do you want to shoot it? Do you want to still shoot movies? And I'm like, yes. In fact, I'm shooting a movie right now. And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, I just want to make sure, because I just want to make sure you still want to shoot movies. And I'm like, yes. And it was like this conversation for like 10 minutes where I was like, do you want me to say no? And it was like a very odd conversation in which I was like, when I hung up, I went, I couldn't tell, like, was he hoping I would say no so we could use Greg Fraser? I literally was, to this day, like going, it was weird, but nonetheless, I knew he wanted me ultimately, and I knew I wanted to do it because our collaboration is so strong, and I feel like we push each other in ways that perhaps if he worked with a cameraman for the first time or a woman for the first time, there would be an unknown factor there. And I knew with this movie we could push each other even further, and he wanted that. And so once I was like, yes, we're doing this, then our conversations were all about how do we make this the best thing we've ever done. Now I feel like every time we set out to make a movie, we try to make sure it's the best thing we've ever done, and we try to take risks and do all kinds of new things that, because we're just trying to become better craftspeople. And this one was certainly like, let's do the most uncompromised thing that we've done to date. Shotdeck is a website that I created, which is basically an image database of screen grabs. Every movie I'd ever pitch for, one of the processes I'd go through is I would think about the movie, and I would start to sort of create a little lookbook from other movies. Movies represented the common language between me and the director, and so I would find them as examples of lighting or color or composition, tone, and use that as an example for us to communicate what the look of that movie is going to be. So from pitch to then prep, and then all the way through shooting, I would compile these folders of screen grabs that were appropriate inspirations for the movie I was doing. And over time, I just wish they were keyworded in like a multitude of ways so that suddenly I wasn't just going back to the same folders and picking out shots, but I could now search for a color, or I could search for a location, or I could search for an emotional thing. So I hired a programmer. It's still a beta site and is used by a bunch of cinematographers and directors and students as just a research tool and a way to collaborate and talk about images to help create the vision for the movie you're working on. I remember finding like an image, this really cool low angle ECU from Dr. Strangelove was just super stark, really low of the general. And there's a shot in the movie, we push in on a wide lens of him sort of alone sitting at a table writing in his journal. And then there's just this really bonkers low angle shot. That might have been inspired somewhat by that Strangelove shot, or the odd framing of a movie like Killing of a Sacred Deer, which I thought was gorgeous and had a tension that was similar to the tension that I felt like Joker would have. To some extent, even though I never looked at them again, they were a leaping off point for Todd and I to have a discussion. You know, a lot of it is like your memory of what a look is. So like whether it's the 70s movies that were more of a memory from, let's say, Network or Taxi Driver or Dog Day Afternoon. And then one of the nice things about looking at stills is you can kind of see them all together as a pastiche and then see, does that feel like this movie? Is that a template we can use? They often were examples of what it wasn't. So in a weird way, you take all these images, you sort of use them as inspiration, and then what comes out on the other end is something hopefully brand new and unique, but they've been influenced in a multitude of ways by a bunch of different things. We both felt like the movie should be 185, and that was cool because we both sort of came at it separately. And then the next question was like, do you think we could shoot 65mm film? We thought because this movie is going to be ultimately a story of extremes, right? Like big wide shots in which he was small, cut against extreme close-ups, in which we wanted that shallow depth of field that anamorphic provides, but not anamorphic. And then we went down that path and we just couldn't afford it. We were shooting in New York. Everything would have to go back to photocam, and as much as the movie still has a budget that's like better than a lot of movies, those things mattered, and they actually mattered enough that we were basically discouraged to shoot that. Then we went to 35. We were going 35 almost till the end of the prep. I kept talking about the attributes of Area 65 and the fact that it would give us the ability to shoot large format, so we'd still get the benefit of our initial instinct photographically. It was really Todd's idea to say, can you show me a test? We stuck a 35mm camera and we stuck an Area 65, shot them side by each, and then really took them into the theater and projected them both. And although film still beats digital in color rendition, it still got it, you could get damn close. And the attributes was, we could do things like shoot at 1600 ASA, we could shoot with less light. Then the next step for me was just, okay, how do I make this as absolutely film-like as possible? And that came from like developing a very specific 5293 LUT with the help of my colorist Jill Bogdanovich and her father, who used to work at Kodak, and really reverse engineer the stocks, build a LUT that was as filmic as absolutely possible. And I do remember when we shot the makeup test, how just beautiful it looked. And Todd loved it. It just like had a richness and a palette and a contrast that felt very film-like to Todd. So much so that they literally released that as like a teaser trailer to show the look of Joker to like the fans and get it out there. So I still love that makeup hair test. It's like, it might be the best work I've ever done. Whenever I'm breaking down a script, that's like the first thing I'm always thinking about, right? Which is like, where is the camera? Where is the camera and what psychological result does that have on the audience, right? So if in the beginning of the movie, we want to find him surrounded by people, surrounded by things, and have physically distance between us and him, we're seeing how the world sees him, right? There's something about shooting on a longer lens that in a weird way sometimes feels even more real. And that carries on through the bus, the next scene. And it's not until we get home with him in an environment where he's now alone, that's when suddenly we start to introduce the proximity, getting much closer to him. Because those are the times in which just us and the audience. It's like here where now suddenly we can be alone with Arthur and see him as his true self, his lonely self, or later in the movie when he becomes Joker, his most flamboyant self. In this movie, I knew we would never do any marks, we would never do any rehearsals. We would never see what Joaquin was gonna do until he did it. So it was always gonna be, first take, let's see what happens. And so under that auspice, I never wanted the technical aspects to interfere with Joaquin's performance ever. So how could I light the spaces and not the faces? The bathroom scene where he makes this metamorphosis and he's like butterfly coming out of a cocoon kind of thing, that was just written as a different scene. Todd and Joaquin decided just, let's do a non-verbal version of this scene. So it was going to be more just experimental and ethereal in a way. And so he had that piece of music that Hildur wrote and started playing it. And that was another example of just the power and the beauty of both Joaquin and having an operator like Jeff Haley is, didn't tell Jeff what we were going to do. Joaquin didn't tell us what he was going to do. We just placed Jeff in the room, handheld, and they worked together, and Jeff reacted off of Joaquin, and Joaquin's really good with the camera. Not only is Joaquin dancing, but Jeff is dancing around him in real time. Obviously, we didn't plan it that way, but I certainly planned to light it in a way that we could go anywhere. So it was always intended to give us that 360 ability. One of the benefits of operating B camera and having such a great operator on A camera is I could also drive the framing and composition and even the blocking of the camera to Joaquin towards the good light. It's a city that is crumbling, or it's on the edge of crumbling. A lot of its residents are in great pain and loneliness, you know? Like even the woman at the beginning who says, "Would you stop bothering my kid?" There's a sense that everyone on that bus is just trying to get through their day. And these citizens are sort of living their own life sort of boxed in, trying to create as little conflict as they could throughout the day. It's a very hard city, and I think one of the things we tried to do with Gotham, whether it's like with the opening scene of him getting smashed by the sign, or that bus scene, or the early things to kind of establish what Gotham feels like, or anytime we had a chance to show Gotham at large, and then there's another subset in which those things literally clash with each other, right? And the best example of that would be like the charity event at Wayne Hall. This protest is happening outside of all these people that are feeling displaced and pained and all these things protesting, and inside it's as tranquil as it could be, right? A bunch of people in tuxedos, and they have zero idea or care about what's happening right outside the doors. So it's that juxtaposition of rich and poor that I think was a big part of this version of Gotham. It's in the perfect place for somebody to send the city into chaos, which is where it ends up. The Murray Franklin set was one of the more fun sets to do because that's a perfect example of where the research was the job. Because that was one straight from the start, outside of production design and wardrobe, really figuring out the color palette. To me, I was trying to just be as authentic as possible to one of those shows back in the day. And look at what Johnny Carson was like. Looked at Merv Griffin, Donahue even. Johnny Carson was really more of the template for Murray Franklin. I would show my operators what was the frame that would be the single, what was the wide shot. And we effectively just completely built a studio. You know, me and Steve Ramsey, my gaffer, we're like, we're not going to use any LEDs. It's only going to be old tungsten units. It's only going to be things that existed in the time. Not just because it was authentic and it would photograph properly, but also because we were shooting it. You know, the other complications of that is the actual cameras that are being photographed are also shooting every single time. So we took Alexa Minis and housed them inside of those cameras, and then created basically fake art-directed lenses to be on the front. Each one of those camera operators were local 600 camera operators, but they also were extras. And then we had this great TV director who does Saturday Night Live named Don King, was sitting in the back of the stage doing a line cut, a live cut just like he does on Saturday Night Live, with those 4 cameras, so that every TV that was on the set were constantly showing the line cut. So if we saw them in the background, they were like actually cutting from close up as if we were shooting the show. So there were a lot of elements going into just every little basic shot in that scene. To some extent, it's the challenges that you sort of remember more than anything. The scene in which he kills the 3 Wall Street guys. So that was one of those examples of just a scene in which we kept going through different versions of how are we going to successfully accomplish the scene. It's a subway car. It has to be moving. First of all, you can't put any graffiti on subways anymore. They don't want to even remind people of those days in the 70s and 80s. So you can shoot live, and then you add the graffiti later. but it didn't provide us enough control. And the solution we came up with, which seemed like the only way, frankly, was to go to some LED technology, because yes, they're riding on a subway car and it should feel real, but it's also hyper real in that it builds to this thing that is suddenly explodes into violence, and it should feel like a fever dream. Every time I go back to New York and I ride the subways, I always look for just the interesting play of light. When it disconnects from the power for a second and the inside goes black, and how the outside lit up from like the tunnel lights would then illuminate the people inside. I was like, this is what we need. We need to have this full control so that we can create this kind of fever dream thing that Todd was describing. And so we went to the LED technology of putting 15-foot screens spread out across 70 feet on either side of the train with a small curve. And then it was like, okay, how do we create the element that's outside of this train? Because now with Homeland Security, they don't want you to actually photograph the inside of subway tunnels in New York City. So they're like, we can't even shoot plates. So then the solution is, okay, what do we put outside those windows? Not only do we have to see things going by, but they actually pull into a station, people get off, they pull out of a station. So me and the visual effects supervisor, Edwin Rivera, we just spent a night driving around subways, taking iPhone and DSLR videos. And what we ended up coming up with was, let's just do it as stills, right? Because effectively movies are just 24 still frames a second, right? And so we got a really nice old station that looked the part, and we walked like one step at a time and took 150 stills or something, and then created like a long timeline of it. And then we just basically created a mock-up of what the train would look like, and then put it out the windows, and we created like 6 layers. One was a light of fluorescence, one were like hanging tungsten lights, one was like a cyan, the other one was a sodium vapor. And so I would sit with a monitor and just watch Jeff operate, and I would just like fire buttons on the board so I could turn off all the lights inside and then run like a really bright light outside the window. And it was like a remarkable solution that we had to come up with. So it was one of those things that I think about that scene a lot, because it was one of the biggest hassles on the movie, but I'm super proud with the way it turned out. I do like that shot under the bridge. He's running after having killed the guys in the subway, and the shadow comes first, and then he follows, and we're following it on a grip trick and chasing him underneath that tunnel with the city in the background. He's running with this sense of desperation, and it's a huge turning point in the movie, probably the biggest turning point in his life. And that shot, it's an homage to old noirish kind of things. It's fun to play with that shadow. It was a symbolic thing for me because I had a whole shadow thing going on in the movie in terms of just what is the shadow to your personality, and as an image, but also the camera movement, I think is probably one of my favorite shots in the movie. I had an amazing crew in Joker. The camera team led by Greg Irwin as a key first, and Tim Metivier was a B camera first. Those guys did a remarkable job. The movie is shot under extreme focus conditions, and they both killed it, and I couldn't have done it without them. Jeff Haley, who's operated for me and with me for a number of movies, is without question the best I've ever worked with, and the movie doesn't do any of the things it does without him. I worked with a bunch of people for the first time in the New York sense, like Steve Ramsey, my gaffer. I'd worked with him in a heartbeat. He was awesome. Tommy Prate, the key grip, was really great. The dolly grips on the crew were really awesome. Todd Maitland, who's the sound mixer, was one of the most fun guys I've worked with, because like me watching everything, he's listening to everything. So we were constantly having conversations about tone and about the performance and all things offset. That was like really lovely to have with the person on crew. So it was awesome, great crew. I was blown away. Like, I remember turning to my wife, I was like, is this working for you? And she goes, this is amazing. And I was like, okay, good, because I felt that way. For me, the best thing about the movie and what Todd did with the movie is he built this slow build throughout the movie, and that final 20 minutes leading into like when he's standing on top of a cop car has so much power to me that, to me, I was just an audience member sitting in the theater, and I'm genuinely really harsh on my own work, and I just literally just said to Todd, I think it's a masterpiece, because it had such an emotional effect on me, and obviously I know every moving part within it, and so the fact that it could still work in the most basic way as an audience member for me and really draw me in and have such power. It was as thrilling an experience as I had watching one of my movies ever, probably.
Murray, one small thing.
Yeah.
When you bring me out, can you introduce me as Joker?